There are times in life that initially appear too insignificant to notice, too ordinary to have any significance. A dinner invitation, a well-known face at the table, and the familiar sound of silverware hitting porcelain. However, fault lines can occasionally occur right in the middle of these everyday situations. Calm, patient, and steady. It was one of those Sunday evenings when everything in the home seemed to be in its proper place. Predictable. Outside, the garden was well kept. My husband always chose the wine that was on the table, dependable, smooth, and dry, similar to him. The quiet that resulted from our son's semester-long absence had long since blended into the background noise. It was not a stranger who sat at our table that evening. On the contrary, he had spent hundreds of years in our home, our son's best friend who is almost family. Once the youngster asked for more lemonade while running through our kitchen barefoot, but he was no longer a boy. Before I had really registered it, I became aware of it. He was bigger and wider now, and he exuded the confident ease that comes after leaving home, stumbling a little, and finding your feet. I had forgotten how dark his hair had been. He had a more pronounced jaw, and there was something measured in his smile, something deliberate. As usual, my spouse was deep in conversation, discussing work market developments and next week's plans. The room was filled with his words, but my thoughts were elsewhere. As I walked around the table, cleaning plates, pouring wine, and laughing at my husband's jokes, it strayed to the way the guest's eyes followed me. Not very clear. It's never clear. However, my husband insisted that his visitor stay the night after the meal. The kind host, the kind buddy, added, "It's late and there's no point driving back at this hour." The young man agreed and nodded while maintaining the same kind grin. He agreed. Of course, my husband disappeared into the kitchen to get more drinks, and I just once saw him across the living room. Even though the look was fleeting, I remembered something about it. That serene assurance of someone who was fully aware of his impact. First, I turned aside. I was forced to. The evening calmed down. As usual, after wine and discussion, my hubby went asleep early. I told myself it was only the caffeine from the coffee I shouldn't have had after dinner, but I remained below, restless. Unable to concentrate, I read the same page of my book 3 times. Before I saw him, I heard the floorboards creak softly. He entered the kitchen through the dark hallway light barefoot and with his shirt slightly unbuttoned. He seems unsurprised to see me there. He seems amused, if anything. Not able to sleep either. He questioned as he cautiously picked up a bottle of water and placed it next to me. As he twisted the bottle's lid off and took a big gulp, his gaze remained fixed on me. I found myself observing more intently than I should have as the muscles in his throat flexed beneath his skin. He leaned back against the counter and remarked, "We walk through the kitchen late at night. In this house, a dangerous habit." My lips parted as like I was going to reply, but I didn't. Rather, I arose and pressed my dress's fabric against my hips. I made a tense motion that I hadn't done in years. He did not approach. He didn't have to. Without it, the distance between us felt tense enough. I could hear my husband's steady breathing upstairs, the faint ticking of the wall clock, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. For a split second, I wondered if he could hear my heart beating as loudly as I could. There was a comfortable silence between us. Intentional. He waited, observing I was aware of that, but I didn't know exactly for what. I forced my voice calm and cleared my throat. I turned to the stairs and said, "You should get some rest." But even as I ascended them, taking slow, methodical steps, I could feel his eyes following me heavy, and there was something very different inside beneath the thin coating of remorse. I persuaded myself I should experience expectation. I was cautious not to wake my spouse as I slipped into bed next to him. He breathed evenly and deeply calm. Although my body was motionless, my thoughts were racing. I wasn't awake that night because of the coffee. Neither the wine nor the book was the cause. It was his eyes that he remembered. The weight of that quiet conversation. One glance had roused something I believed I had long ago buried. I told myself it was nothing, and closed my eyes. I knew I was lying even then, though. I've always thought that our most serious errors aren't the ones that happen on the spur of the moment, not the mishaps that occur in time of crisis. No, the ones we anticipate are the worst, the ones we enter with wide-open eyes. Every action is intentional. Every justification has already been practiced in the back of our minds. The house was abnormally quiet the following morning. My spouse had departed early. As he fell asleep the previous evening, he suggested a last-minute meeting. I was still lying in bed when I heard the front door gently close. I swiveled around to face the window. "Keep your eyes open." Gazing at nothing, I listened to the silence under the covers for longer than I should have. I could feel the accusing weight of the room's atmosphere bearing down on me. He was downstairs when I eventually went, the visitor who was only ever meant to be my son's closest friend, with one hand resting comfortably on the wooden rail and the other carrying a cup of coffee. He stood by the garden at the edge of the porch. At first he was facing away from me, his shirt slung across the chair next to him, exposing his bare flesh to the early morning light. He moved with a confidence and ease that belied the reality that he was still present and still a part of my morning. I stood at the doorway for a moment longer than I should have. Observing him, he had broad shoulders and muscles chiseled in the serene, organic manner of someone who knew what he had without having to flaunt it. Something about the casual tilt of his head felt too intimate in the stillness of the morning, and his hair was a little wet and disheveled from the shower. I nearly went back. In order to avoid the unpleasantness of small conversation over coffee, I nearly persuaded myself to wait until he went, but I went outside instead. At the sound of the door, he turned and instantly met my gaze. The corner of his lips touched that same slow, purposeful smile. "Good morning?" Although I tried to maintain a neutral appearance, I nodded, but politeness couldn't ease the tension between us. Thick and indisputable, it held on to the air. Innocent enough, the talk began with casual comments about the weather and the neighborhood's calmness at this hour. However, it wasn't innocuous for very long. There was something about the way he gazed at me, never rushing, as though he had endless time to force me to acknowledge my feelings. When you water the plants, you always wear this outfit. If it weren't for the way his gaze lingered, his speech would still have that familiar teasing edge that could be mistaken for innocence. I looked down at my lovely linen dress that I had thrown on light blue waist-cinched with tiny straps. It's flattering but comfortable. Perhaps too feminine for a laid-back morning at home. I gave a shrug. Summer is here. However, we were both certain it wasn't the cause. He didn't elaborate on the remark. Leaning back against the railing, he simply grinned and allowed the silence to return between us. He had a certain force in the way he left things unsaid, which made me feel their weight even more. I instructed myself to get out to move away to shatter whatever it was before it could take root further. However, I remained motionless. I remained in the same spot, hands clasped loosely in front of me, feeling the sun's warmth against my skin and the hotter, more menacing heat of his eyes. It wasn't quick enough when I eventually turned to head back toward the home. Before I even got to the door, he was there, moving with such assurance that there was no room for miscommunication. I was stopped in my tracks when his hand gently but forcefully grasped my wrist. As I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. Now that we were too close, the distance between us vanished in a flash. His gaze remained fixed on mine, searching and waiting, not for approval but for confirmation. "You don't think this is a mistake, do you?" His voice was steadier now, quieter. I ought to have replied yes. I ought to have snatched my hand away, stood aside and shook my head. I stayed instead, since the truth was louder than anything I could have spoken and sat heavy in the silence between us. I chose not to respond. Slowly and deliberately, his fingers traced the line of my palm as they moved from my wrist to my hand. Despite the morning's warmth, I could feel the chill creep up my arm and the goosebumps appear on my skin. When it did happen, the moment felt extended. It wasn't reckless. When I didn't pull away, when I leaned into it rather than backed away, it deepened. His lips first touched mine, gently, testing, wondering. With a confidence that made my heart race, his hand slipped to my waist and pulled me in. Standing closer than usual, I gave him a full, voluntarily given kiss in return. I placed my hands on his chest and felt his heart beat steadily beneath them, synchronizing with my own tumultuous beat. It wasn't a sudden pull when he eventually did. He stayed there, his breath warm against my lips, his forehead lightly resting against mine. Neither of us said anything. The silent understanding of two individuals who had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross was all that was present. No apology, no forced joke to dismiss it. With my hands dropping away and my body still tingling where he had touched me, I took the first step back. I turned and went inside without giving him a glance, but as I left, I could feel him observing me, and I was as certain that this would not be the final time as I was of my own name. After you make a choice, you know you can't change. There's a strange silence. It's not as loud as the roar of remorse that occasionally fills your chest. This one, on the other hand, is heavy and gentle like a pleasant fog that covers everything and softens the sharp edges of regret just enough to permit something worse: the want to repeat. Avoidance did not characterize the days that followed. There were no clumsy looks at the ground or desperate attempts to hide what had transpired between us. If anything, the serenity of our subsequent exchanges had an almost sadistic quality, as though neither of us had experienced the seriousness of the decision we had taken, the way we talked about the weather, the garden, and my husband's ambitions for the house. However, the truth had already infiltrated our relationship. It was evident in the way he hesitated just a little too long when I entered the room, and in the way his eyes followed the curve of my hips and up the length of my legs before locking with mine. It was in the way my fingers lingered on my blouse's buttons in the morning, selecting materials that were softer against my skin and cut somewhat closer to my body's natural line than I would have previously ventured. When I spoke, I became very conscious of my body, including my hands, posture, and lip form. It was both thrilling and draining. Happily oblivious, my husband carried on with his routine of work evening news and grocery lists. His life and ours appeared to be undisturbed. He still gave me a cheek kiss in the morning, inquired about my day, and called to let me know if he was going to be late, coming home from work. There was nothing suspicious about his tone. There was no indication that he was aware of how much more time I was spending, picking out my clothes, applying my lipstick with care, or how frequently I looked in the mirror before leaving. My husband casually invited him over again on a Thursday night. I was never interested in the playoffs, but they had plans to watch a game together. I could have simply excused myself from the entire living room. I had the option to make tea upstairs, curl up with a book, and let them enjoy their evening without any interruptions. However, I didn't. Rather, I walked slowly through the kitchen, cleaning a counter that didn't require cleaning, and feigning ignorance of the silent tension that gathered in the pauses between sentences each time I passed in front of them. His gaze followed me. I didn't turn around. As the game continued, the room was filled with the same monotonous chatter. With his beer in hand, my husband's eyes were fixed on the television. They enjoyed easy laughter, exchanged inside jokes from years of acquaintance, and engaged in the easy banter of two guys who had seen each other develop. Tracing the line where my blouse dipped into my collarbone, I remained close enough to hear him close enough to feel his gaze tug me once more. The atmosphere seemed to change when my husband got up to take a call in the adjacent room, leaving us for a moment alone. Before I saw him move, I could feel him, the measured steps across the distance between us, the soft scrape of his chair against the floor. I didn't look around. I didn't have to. Softly, his voice reached me from behind. "You're intentionally doing this." I folded a dish towel that had previously been folded twice to keep my hands occupied. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. He didn't have to. Unquestionably, the tension between us grew thicker. The magic was partially broken when my husband's footsteps reverberated down the corridor. The pain persisted, dangling between us like an incomplete sentence. The pattern was the same for the subsequent trips. My husband's informal invitations, little get-togethers that brought us closer without raising any red flags. As every time the gravity increased as the distance between us narrowed, I began to make excuses to be close to him, restocking snack bowls, bringing him more drinks, and laughing too loudly at unfunny jokes. Every time he looked across the room, every hand-to-shoulder movement was staged perfectly, and he always met me there, unwavering, steady, and never the first to turn away. But the things that hurt me the most were the littlest gestures, the way his fingertips would delicately brush my wrist when he handed me a glass, or the way his knee would barely touch mine under the dinner table. Short enough to deny but long enough to feel is the interval between each of these moments. When my husband excused himself to the garage one evening, leaving us to clear the table by ourselves, it all came to a head. The only thing preventing me from shaking was the movement of my hands as I carefully gathered the dishes and stacked them in orderly, purposeful stacks. We briefly made contact as he reached across me and removed a dish from my grasp. He did not draw his fingers away. His thumb brushed lightly over my knuckles as they remained there, resting against mine. "You know what's going on here," he added in a steady, low voice. My chest tightened every breath. My hands clenched around the plate's edge, my white knuckles digging into the porcelain. With our bodies now too close together in the small area between the table and the counter, I turned completely toward him. My voice didn't falter, but it came weaker than I had planned. "Furthermore, you won't stop it, will you?" I saw it for the first time as his gaze swept over my face. The conflict between want and discipline that took place just beyond his serene gaze, the tension beneath his effortless smile, he said, "I'm not sure either of us wants to." I could feel the heat radiating from his skin as we stood there in that breathless moment, the unspoken promise of what would happen next vibrating between us like a live wire. The air returned to normal when my husband came in from the garage, his voice calling out nonchalantly as if the walls of this house weren't already steeped with betrayal, the heavy door swinging shut, the clatter of tools. However, both he and I were aware we had already gone too far. Living with someone you want to be with while acting as though nothing is burning beneath the surface is a strange form of cruelty. Your body will continue to betray you in subtle ways that no one else would notice the more you suppress yourself. The way your eyes automatically seek them out before your mind can catch up the immediate tightness in your shoulders as they enter the room. The breath that pauses a second too long when their hand touches too close. It had been my spouse who had suggested the picnic. Just the three of us, a day at the lake, a weekend trip out of town, just a small get-together with no major festivities or special occasions. Known harmless. That's how he intended it to be. Anyway, I concurred too soon, too enthusiastically, and as soon as I said those things, I felt terrible about myself. In actuality, though, I desired it. I desired the excruciating pain of sitting close to him once more. The tension that none of us was stupid enough or brave enough to mention aloud I desired that restraints heat, the pull of desire that one cannot resist. I stood in front of the mirror for a longer period of time than normal on the morning of the trip. I wore a light dress, soft fabric that held me in place, just enough to remind me of my shape, without drawing too much attention to itself. I wore a lovely lace bra, a faint flush under the flimsy cloth. Present but hidden, carefully chosen because I needed to feel it against my skin, not so that my spouse would like it. I required the reminder. With the mechanical ease of a pair long used to these minor routines, we loaded baskets, blankets, and folding chairs into the car. He helped my husband put the cooler in the trunk and arrived on time, grinning effortlessly. They lapsed into the cadence of old familiarity, joked and laughed, and his eyes were fixed on me over the car's top for a fraction longer than courteous. My husband, who has always preferred to drive, got into the car and we relaxed comfortably. As I usually did on these travels, I sat in the back, leaving the passenger seat free for the visitor. Just a little courtesy. A simple explanation. I observed how his arms relaxedly extended down the back of the headrest as he sank into the front seat. I held my fingers in my lap, clenching them till they hurt. With everything we didn't say, the void between us felt oppressive. The smooth, nondescript road stretched out in front of us. The type of drive in which the landscape is repeated, tree rows, brief glimpses of the sky between power lines, and the soft sound of tires on asphalt filled the quiet moments when people stopped talking. However, there was nothing smooth about the automobile. Everything my spouse said, including innocuous remarks about the week, the weather, and the route, seemed to be static. When I had to respond, I did it in a soft, even tone. However, I couldn't take my eyes off the hand that slackly hung over the headrest, tapping lightly against the leather just inches from where my calf lay beneath the seat's curvature. My leg bumped against the back of the passenger seat as the car rocked slightly, and the road twisted abruptly. I moved, but not out nearer. Delicate, measured. He remained still. Rather, his fingers ceased their tapping and settled silently against the seat's edge so near that an additional inch would have closed the distance between us. My husband was unaware of it, as he discussed the market, the changes at work, the updates from our kid, the same rhythm, the same secure, well-worn routine. His eyes remained fixed on the road, and his voice remained steady. However, there was more than simply space between his best friend's hand and my body. It was a query, a request, a recognition. We laid the blanket out under a huge oak tree at the lake and unpacked the baskets. There were birds above the distant laughing of families strewn down the shore, the occasional splash of someone plunging into the sea, and a subtle scent of pine and water in the air. Calm. Typical. I couldn't feel at peace, though, not so near him. Not with every look and every closeness weighing down my flesh. We played, ate, and conversed normally. And all the while I could feel the pain of desire pressing down harder on my throat, chest, and ribs. I remained sitting when my husband got up to answer a phone and went a little farther down the shore for seclusion. He also stayed. At first, neither of us said anything. There was nothing unpleasant about our stillness. It was purposeful and filled with all the things we were afraid to say. I forced myself not to look at him as I etched circles into the blanket's fabric beneath my fingertips, concentrating on the movement. Still his eyes were fixed on me. Heavy, persistent. Finally, he said, "You're quiet today. Now speak more quietly." Softer. I took a while to reply. I had a constricted throat. I shifted, folding my legs under me and placing my hands into my lap to stop my trembling as the breeze pushed chilly air along my thighs and lifted the edge of my dress. "I'm all right. I couldn't have told a safer lie." His gaze remained fixed on mine. I detested how much I wanted him to grab me at that precise moment, how I longed for him to get closer to me, to allow his fingers to once more discover my wrist's line, to let his mouth to serve as a reminder of how quickly I may forget the life I had created. However, he remained still. I didn't either. Upon my husband's return, we both reverted to our comfortable facade of sharing stories, laughing, and conversing, tucked away, but not forgotten. The moment folded itself neatly back into the silence between us. We got back into our routines on the way home. While his best friend sat quietly in the front seat with one hand again resting softly against the headrest, my husband was talking happily and keeping his eyes on the road, and me back there with my fingers gripped in my lap. Beneath the normal, quiet hum of the wheels rotating beneath us, our hearts were racing. There was nothing else to go wrong. All that was left was to wait. The yearning itself isn't the worst aspect of desire. The waiting is the problem. After that excursion, the days seemed to drag on forever. The silence between us remained. It expanded, dug deeper into the nooks and crannies of daily existence, and coiled itself around every moment we spent together, even the most commonplace ones. It turned into the air we inhaled. Between every word, every look, and every deliberate movement, there was the unspoken, I noticed that I was looking at the time more frequently than normal, and calculating how many days I had left based on the likelihood that I would see him again. Even little things become intolerable. In order to keep myself closer to the potential of him, I made excuses to be close to the front windows, to go through the rooms where he might be, and to turn a straightforward activity into something more. I detested how apparent it seemed and how helpless I felt to stop it. Before long, the next chance presented itself. As part of his usual routine, my husband arranged his work trip weeks in advance. Nothing out of the ordinary for 2 days out of town. The house is supposed to be quiet, and our kid is still away at school. Predictable. When I saw his name appear on my phone, I convinced myself it was a coincidence. When I responded, I told myself that I had no idea what I was doing. "The other day, I left my jacket at your house." His tone was even and informal as he spoke. I nearly grinned at the effort he put into keeping things tidy, because the deception was so flimsy and clear. Nearly I could have promised to leave it on the porch for him. A time when my husband would be home is something I could have offered. I had the option to shut that door before we both entered in once more. However, I didn't. I told him that I would spend the afternoon at home instead. After that, I didn't give the jacket any thought. I listened to the sound of his voice, the purposeful quietness of it. The query that lingered beneath his word's surface, I remembered the last time I had been caressed by his hands. My body had leaned into his so effortlessly, how his lips against mine had made my breath catch. I stood in front of my closet for longer than I should have. My fingertips continued to linger over the dresses, which felt too soft, too provocative, and too simple to mistake for intention, even if I told myself I was being stupid. Ultimately, I decided to wear the one I was afraid to wear in front of my spouse. The neckline is just low enough to show me the straps are tiny and the color is pale cream. The blush lace bra is once more below it. Not for him. For me. For the way knowing what was below the cotton made me feel. My hair was silky and clean from the morning shower, and I let it fall loose down my back without any perfume. He knocked, and it was a faint sound. Be cautious. Without hesitation, I opened the door. This time there was no pretense. He made no request for the jacket. The courteous small talk that used to break up our conversations didn't bother him. Once his gaze passed over me, deliberate, slow, and finally centered on my face. We didn't both smile. Between us, the quiet was louder than words could have conveyed. I moved out of the way and allowed him in without saying anything. With a decisive decision like weight, the door clicked shut behind him. As we stood there, we were separated by a breath. Neither takes the lead. My hands, which were loosely at my sides, were trembling, and I could feel my heartbeat pounding so loudly in my chest that I was certain he could hear it. You won't act as though you didn't want me to attend, would you? He spoke softly and without sarcasm. I had the option to lie. I might have chuckled. I could have ignored this, turned my back, and buried it under the pile of arguments against it. However, I didn't. Rather, I remained motionless, allowing the question to linger between us, and my silence provided him with all the information he required. Slowly, the distance shrank. Don't hurry. This time, no impulse was stolen. His hand extended, tracing the contour of my collarbone, touching the bare line of my shoulder, and then slowly slipping under my dress's strap, like a spark catching dry leaves. His touch, which was barely there, sparked every nerve beneath my skin. An uncontrollable chill went up my spine. As if learning my contour by heart, his thumb brushed the corner of my mouth as his hand advanced to my face. His steady gaze remained fixed on mine as he asked and waited. The kiss came without the reluctance of the first, when he leaned in. This was not the meticulous examination of two unsure individuals. This was done with full knowledge and intent. It was the kiss of someone who had been too patient and too reserved. Even as my head begged me to stop, I reached out, uncertain yet drawn in, and dug into the material of his shirt, drawing him in closer. However, my body deceived me by pressing against him, leaning in and craving for more. His expression grew more intense as the kiss intensified, and his hand moved behind my neck to hold me there and prevent me from moving. Through the space between us, I could feel the weight of his body pressing on every line of me. Even so, there was still a part of me that hoped the guilt would surface, overpower the desire, and bring me back to reality. However, it didn't. It was silent. Our breathing was labored and erratic when we eventually parted. His thumb traced gentle circles against my flesh, just above the material of my dress, while his hand hovered at my waist. "You should tell me to go," he continued in a quieter, rougher voice. However, I didn't. I said absolutely nothing. Rather, I grabbed his hand and gently held his hand, tucking my fingers between his and squeezing him tightly. Unspoken words were blazing at the borders of our stillness, creating a heated atmosphere between us. We both did not approach the door. We both didn't want to. Moments after crossing a line you know you can't uncross have a peculiar, irresistible pleasure. A perilous stillness akin to standing too near a precipice, observing the crashing waves below, sensing the wind at your back and knowing that it would only take a slight tilt to allow oneself to fall. That day I didn't tell him to go. I didn't move at all. I was still clutching his hand as I stood there, still feeling the consequences of my decision, but I was also itching for more. Something inside of me seemed to have broken, but not all at once. Quiet and methodical, more like thread by thread. The house felt too large and motionless after he departed. I felt exposed by every noise, every floor creak and every curtain rustling, as if the walls themselves had seen what had transpired between us and were only waiting for me to confess it aloud. However, remorse never manifested itself as I had anticipated. It did not rush in with panic or shame. It was a gentle, persistent whisper that only had one question for me. "When are you going to see him again?" I gave him more thought than I wanted to acknowledge. The warmth of his mouth against mine, the sensation of his hands on my flesh, and the assurance in his eyes as he caressed me, all of which suggested that he already knew how easily I would give in. I saw the color that appeared on my cheeks as my thoughts returned to him, and I realized that I had been staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror for too long. I began dressed differently for the version of myself I was feeling at the time, not even for my husband. Audacious. Get up wanted. My spouse was as loving as ever when he got back from his vacation, courteous, thoughtful, steady. The dependable man with whom I had established a life. He put his arms around my waist while I cooked dinner on the stove, kissed my forehead as soon as he entered, and inquired about my week plans and projects. As usual, I responded, even my voice, I practiced my words. However, I no longer felt comfortable in his embrace, too conscious, too much. I felt a dreadful twist in my gut with every affectionate move he made, not from his touch, but from the incessant comparison that kept coming to mind. I became aware of the distance that had always existed and the carefree, hungerless way his hands passed over me. The habitual way his lips found mine. It was sweet and soft, but it lacked the yearning that was so evident elsewhere. I attempted to meet him in bed one night when he reached over me and planted kisses on my shoulder. I desired to his physique was so familiar that I wanted to lose myself in it, to allow him to take away the taste of someone else's food. However, I experienced a different type of anguish in my chest as his fingertips stroked over my flesh. He touched cautiously, kind, everything about him that I used to adore. However, it was insufficient. A long period had passed since then. I forced myself to remain motionless beneath him until it was over, turning my face toward the pillow and choking back the tears that welled up behind my eyes. I scrubbed my skin till it felt raw the following morning, standing under the shower's hot spray for longer than I should have, to quiet the shame that coiled itself around my throat, not to wash him away. Even so, my thoughts returned to the memory of his presence, despite the water's sting the weight of other people's mouths. The kiss wasn't the only thing. The body wasn't the only thing. His gaze on me was the cause, his perception of me, not as a spouse, not as a mother to anyone, not as the trustworthy component of the home puzzle, however, as a woman complete, wanted, alive. We only happened to cross paths again by chance, or so we acted. The downtown gym, one of our small town's few neutral spots, a location I hadn't been in weeks. I hardly utilized that membership, but when he entered, I was already there, tying my shoes and tightening the straps of my sports bra over a baggy tank top. Before I even turned around, I could feel his gaze on me. He had a slight smile, but underneath it was a gleam. Something informed me that this was no accident, not totally. Initially, I maintained a safe distance performing my routine, as though my hands weren't trembling, as if the weight of longing didn't make my stomach tight. However, closeness tends to weaken resistance more quickly than words ever could. We happened to cross paths close to the weights going in different ways. His hand briefly touched the small of my back as we went past one another. He said softly enough for only I to hear, "Didn't expect to see you here." I didn't either. I did not, however, relocate. The manner I began searching for him there following that day was risky. The way I looked for excuses to stay after working out, hoping for that chance encounter, that quick chat by the lockers, or the unsaid promise that hovered between our words. My body lied to me every time I saw him. The reddening of my face, the tug on my abdomen, the pain beneath my skin aching for another touch from him. He was also aware. He was fully aware of my desire for it. I wanted him just as much. We didn't say it aloud. We didn't need to. It was there in the silence that encircled us like hands in the weight of our gazes and in the times when we were a bit too close. It was just a question of time. Some invitations don't require verbal communication. Some are formed with a quick glance, an excessively extended pause, or a breath maintained for only a fraction of a second longer than is required. Others arrive as innocuous recommendations that appear innocent on the outside, but are burdened with malicious purpose. On the surface, I hardly responded when he brought up the lake cottage. As if it were merely a fleeting notion, a casual comment slipped between the lines of a brief discussion at the gym. His eyes remained fixed on mine as he spoke softly, almost playfully. "According to what I've been told, your spouse intends to rent the cabin once more next month. It's a pleasant location." I nodded and gave a vague response. However, the phrases became ingrained in my chest like seeds, waiting for the ideal time to sprout. I was familiar with the location, a familiar getaway that we had used numerous times for family weekends, holidays, and the occasional get-together with friends was a tiny house nestled just outside of town, the kind of place where memories are securely woven into the fabric of a shared life, where warmth and laughter are welcomed. However, neither of us was considering that. The suggestion was made again when we next met. It's more of a potential that hangs in the air between us than a question. The words hung there soft as vapor. Sometimes it's easier when you're not surrounded by so many eyes. I should have cut the thread before it tightened around my throat and turned away. Instead, I let the thought to grow inside of me, subtly blossoming in the shadows where my remorse was yet unable to reach. It was easy to find the excuse. My spouse, who constantly advocates for a change of pace, shared his plans for the weekend: play golf with coworkers at a tournament that takes place overnight, 2 towns over. I wished him well, nodded and grinned. My face is the ideal representation of support, and my voice is steady. However, I sensed the tug intensifying within. When the SMS arrived, I responded right away, since it was straightforward and devoid of any type of politeness. I'll be there at 6 o'clock tomorrow. I promised myself that I would not get ready, that I would not consider this a worthy occasion to dress up for. But as soon as I was standing in front of my closet, touching the fabrics with my fingers and considering the implications of each decision, the lie came to an end. I went with black instead of silk or lace. Just plain cotton that feels good against my skin and hugs my body just enough to show me the shape underneath. Again, the blush-colored lace underneath, a practice that is now familiar. I brushed my hair back from my face and let it fall loose. Just a hint of gloss on my lips. No heavy makeup. Enough to give the impression that I wasn't concealing. The sky was gentle with the start of sunset when I drove to the lakehouse. The sun was painting the horizon in tones of gray and gold as it sank low behind the hills. As I came up, the sound of the dirt crunching beneath my tires was too loud for the silence. My fingers were sticky with apprehension, and I was surprised at how tightly my hands held the driving wheel. The door was unlocked already. Slowly, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The familiar smell of old wood and pine, as well as the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. With shadows creeping into the room's corners, the air within was colder. The floor was covered in a pool of warm light from a solitary lamp that was illuminated by the window. His arms were loosely folded across his chest as he stood close to the table, leaning back slightly against the edge. As soon as I went in, his steady, calm gaze found me and watched. This time, there was no introduction or kind words to downplay the seriousness of our purpose. "You arrived," he remarked plainly. I looked him in the eye and held it. "I would, as you knew," and that was all. As the door clicked behind me, I stood there with my heart thumping so loudly that it seemed to fill the entire room. I didn't approach just yet. I wanted him to sense the purposeful gravity of my decision and the lack of hesitation. He took his time coming to me. He remained in the same spot, waiting with his eyes fixed on mine. The deep, unclumsy silence was charged with everything we hadn't yet touched. One cautious step at a time, he uncrossed his arms, pushed away from the table, and gradually closed the distance between us. I could smell the subtle hint of his fragrance and feel the heat emanating from his body when he stopped right in front of me, crisp, clean, and well-known. He lifted his hand and traced the line of my jaw, his fingertips grazing the side of my cheek, even though it was a gentle touch. His fingertips ignited my flesh like fire. He looked for any indication of retreat in my eyes. I gave him nothing. There was no haste or recklessness in the way his lips greeted mine. It was a slow, thoughtful offering. I tilted my head in his direction as he leaned in closer, with a look of understanding, his hand sliding back into my hair and running fingers through the strands, feeling the steady throb of his heartbeat beneath my palms. I allowed myself to sink into it and raise my hands to rest against his chest. Instinctively, my body shifted toward him, filling the remaining gap between us. The taste of the kiss was one of surrender and confession. Only when he leaned back slightly to gather his breath and delicately pressed his forehead against mine did it break. "I've given this more thought than I should," he said, his words barely audible over the distance between them. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. I let the silence do the talking, and it was just getting dark. Sometimes the body deceives the mind so thoroughly that you can no longer act in control. You no longer act as though there is a choice. The choice of what to do next ceases to exist. It turns into gravity, steadily and mercilessly drawing you beneath. As I stood there with his hands following the curve of my spine under the flimsy material of my dress, I should have felt ashamed. I should have been tired of feeling guilty thinking of the guy I had vowed to live for, the house we had constructed, and the years we had spent combining our lives into one. However, my only emotion was the want to remain in my current location. I was out of breath from the kiss, my skin alive under the warmth of his touch, my lips tingling from the recollection of his mouth against mine. As though my muscles had already learned his shape, I found myself leaning into him and gravitating toward the warmth of his body. There was no space for uncertainty. I'd burned it out of me. Nevertheless, I didn't reach for him when he eventually took a step back, released his hand, and reestablished the cautious barrier between us. I didn't plead with him to remain near me. The unfinished sentence of the night lingered in the area where words would have failed anyhow, and we stood there, both of us silent, our bodies still throbbing with the weight of what had just transpired between us. The lakehouse's atmosphere was too quiet. The tiny lamp in the corner just touched the room's margins with its glow, creating gentle shadows on the wood-paneled walls. As I shifted, unsure of whether to sit, stand, or run, I heard a slight creak of the floor beneath my feet. None of those things were done by me. Rather, I approached the window with my arms folded loosely across my chest and my gaze following the water's reflection outside. Above the lake, the moon hung low, its thin light glimmering on the dark surface, the radiance broken into fragments by waves. I could feel the weight of his stare behind me. Our quiet wasn't meaningless. It was charged with all of the things we had already spoken without using words, and all of the things we couldn't say. Even in the silence, my heart continued to beat too quickly and too forcefully, and I questioned whether he could hear it. At last, he spoke in a quiet but confident tone. "Don't you think we're going to stop?" At the sound of his question, I closed my eyes, the truth of it slamming into the back of my throat. His tone was one of recognition of the truth that we were both too exhausted to reject not one of blame or menace, leaning back against the window frame and letting my fingers brush the edge of the wooden sill behind me. I glanced back to him. When I responded, my voice was more steady than I had anticipated. No, just one word enough. Neither of us immediately approached. In the distance, in the constraint, there was an odd reverence, a silent realization that there was no need to hurry what was transpiring between us. Already, it was certain I saw him observing me, his gaze following the contour of my mouth, the gentle slope of my shoulders and the line of my throat. What did he see there, I wondered? Hunger and guilt. I pondered whether he detested me for making things so simple for him. If his lack of resistance made him despise himself. He didn't display it, though, if he did. Rather, he went to the tiny kitchen and poured himself a glass of water from the counter's pitcher in the room's corner. He spoke again, this time more quietly, with his back to me. "Is he even aware of you?" I was surprised by how biting the question was. It was true, but not because it was cruel. I didn't respond. I was unable to. I choked on the memories of my husband's hand resting on my back at supper, and his soft kiss on my cheek before he left for work every morning. The words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, the steady little movements of a man who thought I was happy. However, desire and contentment are not synonymous. My thoughts spun, but I remained where I was, grounded by the cool wood beneath my palms. It wasn't that I wasn't loved by my husband. I had never questioned that, however, love had become a habit. Somewhere along the line, being careful had become a duty. It was not hunger that hit me, but affection habitually kissed me without need, and for so long I had convinced myself that it was sufficient, that wishing for more was infantile, irrational, and selfish. However, as I stood there in the gentle light of that lamp observing the man who wasn't my husband, stroll across the room with such ease, I became aware of how profoundly the hunger had subsided, how much I'd buried to maintain harmony, how much I had suppressed since it was simpler that way than asking for something he was no longer able to provide. Once more, I could feel the heat rising in my chest as the mixture of wrath, longing, and shame twisted beneath my ribs. He didn't say anything when he turned back to me, glass in hand. He didn't have to. I was the first to move. In 2 long strides, the distance between us shrank, and I grabbed him by the shirt's fabric and drew him to me. Once more his lips found mine, this time more coarsely, the restraint starting to crumble under the weight of everything we were suppressing. His hand rested gently at my side as they discovered my waist and moved under the hem of my dress. I wanted the touch, the assurance that this was real, that it wasn't just in my brain, so I arched into him. Only when breathing became impossible, both of us gasping silently in the silence, did we split apart. I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead on his chest, feeling his heart pound steadily beneath my palms. Neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. We both knew we weren't done yet, but the line had been crossed once more. The speed with which want transforms into habit, how one tiny surrender leads to another, and how the weight of the first decision makes the second feel lighter and easier, until the line you vowed never to cross is so far behind you that it disappears into the haze of memory. All of this can be frightening. This can be. My life's rhythm did not break after the night at the lakehouse, contrary to my expectations. Mornings continued to arrive with their usual routines, and the sun continued to rise. The sound of the dishwashing, the sound of coffee brewing, and my husband's soft footsteps echoing through the kitchen. He asked the same questions about my day and the errands I had planned, and he gave me the same warm grin and kiss on the forehead. And I responded in the same manner as always, realistic, gentle, and steady. But everything was different beneath that exterior. It was all on fire. I believed that the guilt would overwhelm me, gnaw at my throat, make me confess and cause me to crumble beneath the weight of my actions. However, guilt is shrewd. It doesn't always come in waves until you catch your breath incorrectly and feel the pressure of it pressing down. It can sometimes creep in silently and settle into the corners of your chest like dust. I continued to wait for the embarrassment to stop me. Rather, it fueled the desire. We didn't discuss the events at the lake. There were no muddled declarations or hushed vows. Only the unspoken recognition with each glance, unintentional contact, and too prolonged silence, and the same unwritten agreement was followed in every subsequent encounter. We wouldn't act apologetic. I soon began looking for reasons to see him once more, something left at home that was forgotten. A joint errand. The most basic explanations, brief and obvious, but sufficient to provide us with the moments we desired. Enough to support the necessity. The distinction between control and surrender became increasingly hazy. With each meeting, a spark had grown into a wildfire that was engulfing the areas between us more quickly than either of us could extinguish it. But I wasn't destroyed by passion alone. His gaze on me was the cause. The way he viewed me as a woman beneath the roles I performed so well and the layers of responsibility. He saw me as more than just a mother, a wife, or the caretaker of someone else's house. I was hunger, desire, and flesh. They wanted me, and it became more difficult to view myself in any other light the more he viewed me in that manner. No matter how solid or loving my spouse was, it made no difference. He continued to hold my hand at dinner and inquire about my day with sincere concern, but it made no difference, because his hands were kind, courteous, and consistent when they touched me. Hunger, pain, and urgency were absent. I became more aware of the little things, the way his lips found my cheek rather than my mouth, how rather of embracing me like someone he may lose his hands, stroked my skin as though I might shatter. How long has it been? Like way, I wondered. I had persuaded myself for so long that love without passion was sufficient. The silence between my husband and I became unbearable on one of those calm evenings at home, with the television flickering in the background, and his focus split between his phone and the screen. It felt like I was standing outside looking in through the glass, even though I was sitting next to him on the couch and could feel the warmth of his body. I looked over and saw him scrolling absently, his expression comfortable and familiar, secure. I became aware of how far I had strayed at that very instant. I'd been hoping for him to notice for so long. However, he didn't. The distance in my gaze was invisible to him. The weight of the distance that had developed between us was not felt by him, or perhaps he did, and he didn't want to call it that any more than I had for so long. He left early for work the following morning. A kiss at the entrance. A gentle farewell, the same pattern, and I stood in the kitchen, my hands shaking against the counter's edge, feeling the pain of the life I was still struggling to maintain, as the door clicked shut behind him. On the table, my phone buzzed once. His name illuminated the screen as he sent a brief message, nothing to say. Only the location and time. That's how simple it was. I didn't think twice.